and welcome back to another video. So today we're going to be covering two things. A tiny bit of an interview, because I know we've done loads of those already, but mainly going to be talking about the idea of an expansion every year and some of the pros and cons. Now you're probably thinking to yourself, well, you made a video about that like a week and a half ago. Well, now more information came out. Tom Chilton actually said at one of the Gamescom interviews that Warlords of Draenor may only have 2 rating tiers, depending on how long it takes them to make the next expansion. Now that basically means sort of yearly to every 14-month expansions, and I've got some thoughts on the pros and cons of that. But first of all, let's just get through a few of just the other gumph that was covered in the interview. So first of all, there's some stuff about legendary items. He said that Terran Gore's staff could be a legendary item. He said that Gorehowl, that's it, whoops. Yeah, the Gorehowl could be a legendary, and that basically there are going to be other things in addition to the legendary ring, and the legendary ring will have an effect based off what kind of spec you currently are, so that certainly is quite cool. He also talked about Time Walker dungeons. This is a topic that I probably will visit at some point in the channel, but he said that they still just don't know how to do rewards. He also said that in terms of raids, the Molten Core revamp wasn't really designed to be ultra challenging, and it's not designed to be particularly repeatable. You go in there once, you get your loot, and then you're kind of done. Now on the topic of just Time Walker raids in general, he did say, you know, whatever, we want to do it after dungeons, but again, it's just about finding a reward scheme. I'll just scroll down on my my notes here, because guess what, you can't do these without notes unless you're a magician. Yeah, he said that, of course, Warlords of Draenor may only have 2 raid tiers depending on the speed of the next expansion. That's the main topic of this video. I'll talk about that more in a minute. He also said that, you know, new rewards will be added to the main world events and things like that at some point. But right now, they're kind of working in patch 6.1, 6.2, and the next expansion, so they don't exactly know when they'll get onto that. Then finally, he said that Kil'jaeden and Archimonde will have a role to play in the expansion, but they will not be bosses. Now this is interesting, and this also plays into the whole talk about the yearly expansions and the 2 raid tiers per expansion. And yeah, that's the interview points covered. So let's talk about this idea of, just the expansion flow. So what we currently know is 6.0, you know, ends with us, destroying Blackrock Foundry and doing all that stuff. And we also know that Tanaan Jungle is going to be the final raid tier of Warlords of Draenor, and that it will contain Grommash Hellscream and a bit of a Burning Legion influence. We also know that the Burning Legion is not very happy about what's going on after the cinematic, and they're going to sort of step up their efforts, I guess. And of course, this is all rather fun and interesting. But what are the pros and cons of all these yearly, this sort of idea of a yearly expansion? Because if there are only 2 raid tiers, well, you guys know how long a raid tier lasts, right? That's putting us at maybe a 14-month expansion rather than an 18 to 20-something month expansion. Hopefully not a 24-month expansion, i.e., well, 2 years, like Pandaria. Actually, Pandaria will be more than 2 years. It will be like 2 years and 2 months. Damn, that's crazy. Anyway, so, first of all, pro number 1. We'll get lots of new settings if we constantly get a new expansion every year. Every expansion is going to have loads of new zones, you know, new art palette, new everything, new music, a new style, a new theme. That would be really cool actually to get on a yearly basis, because generally I find that, you know, my first year in expansion is really interesting in terms of the scenery, but after a year I definitely get bored. Well, if there's a new expansion every year, that would be solved, frankly, so there's one definite pro. Another nice thing is that it would cause the story to move rather quickly. You know, you'd have 2 raid tiers, so you'd have a concise sort of singular story between them, but then you'd have an overarching story across multiple expansions, and I just think that a yearly format allows for that to happen in a bit more of a sort of free nature, I guess. Certainly the pace of the story would increase, and that might be pretty good for player retention and just how interested people are. Another thing about yearly expansions is that it would allow for rapid iteration on ideas and things like that. If they're making a full expansion set every year, then, you know, big features and things like that can really just chop and change between expansions, and just in terms of iterating upon their designs and, you know, evolving, that stuff would be pretty good. Yeah, I think that could totally, definitely happen. And now another great thing about yearly expansions is that it would mean no Siege of Orgrimmar, no 14 months, no, none of that crap, basically, because believe me, that stuff was absolute crap. Yeah, no big waits in between expansions. Now, I think those big waits actually could be really good for retention. If you look at World of Warcraft's kind of growth phase, well, it peaked at, Wrath of the Lich King, and then it started falling down. Now, yes, it started decreasing for many reasons, but one thing that I think a lot of people don't talk about too often is that, it grew a lot during the Burning Crusade, and then the Sunwell came out, I think, March 25th. March the 25th, 2008, and then, this is the crazy thing actually when you think about it, and Wrath of the Lich King came out November 13th that year. That's basically like having a major content patch for us appear in March. Yeah, that's just like having patch 5.6 and a whole new full-sized raid appearing in March. Imagine what that would have done for Pandaria. Now, after the Burning Crusade, we didn't have that. We had a year of ICC, we had, I think it was a year of Dragon Soul, we will have 14 months Siege of Orgrimmar. Their end expansion woes have been drastically just larger since the Burning Crusade, and I think that's definitely one thing that's really dragged the game down, and if there was yearly expansions, then we would have that nice Burning Crusade effect where there's always something going on. There was the Sunwell patch which led straight into Wrath. Okay, it was 7.5 months before Wrath came out, but I think 7.5 months is generally enough for a raid tier. It's certainly quite a bit less than 14 months. That's crazy. Now then, there are quite a few cons as well, and there's probably more cons than pros numerically, but in balance, I think it is certainly something that could go very well. It could go poorly, could go well, we just don't know, but I think there's definitely a lot of potential. So then, the cons. Well, rather than Blizzard making new features like the flexible raid system during an expansion and maybe releasing it in 5.4, stuff like that would, I'd say, nearly definitely be held off to the next expansion. If you have only 2 raid tiers in an expansion, then I don't think you can have major system changes occur in the final one. That should just be consistent and be saved for the next expansion. Now that is bad, and then maybe it would mean we'd have to wait a little bit longer for 1 or 2 features or something like that, but one of the good points about it actually is that we would get, I'd say, a more refined version of those systems if they are fully being, developed with the sort of, with a new expansion's deployment in mind. And I'd say that within each individual expansion, we would not have much innovation. The way that, say, like Mists of Pandaria really did evolve from patch to patch, I'd say that what would happen with yearly expansions is you wouldn't have much evolution from patch to patch, you just have more, just kind of, the same-ish style of content, but then the next expansion would bring a load of new stuff. I think that's how it would work, I guess. Alright, so the other negative is, of course, it's more expensive. It doesn't seem like Blizzard would really be willing to, decrease the price of an expansion by 1/3, so we would probably have these $10 more expensive expansions coming out twice as much, so it would be significantly more expensive to play World of Warcraft. I guess that's going to be a con for a lot of people. For me, I don't particularly mind. I'm happy to pay for content as long as it's good content, but I can certainly understand and empathize with that point. I'd hope that if they were releasing new expansions in a yearly format, that they would actually just give you a free month with the expansion. I think that would be a really consumer-friendly way to do it, that would actually encourage people to jump back into the game from expansion to expansion, and if they did that, it would definitely help player retention. Okay, so the next possible pitfall is the bloat in leveling time. If you're bolting on 10 levels every single year, you're going to be level 150 in 5 years' time, and wow, leveling from 0 to 150 sounds a bit mental in my opinion. And really, how would they fix that problem? Right now, they've just been trying to accelerate us through content, but if they try to accelerate us through the, the early leveling zones any faster, it's going to be a disjointed mess, even more so than it currently can be, especially if you take heirlooms into account. So how the hell are they going to do it? Well, it's the sort of thing that actually, I'd be worried that instead of designing a really innovative solution around this leveling problem, Blizzard would perhaps just rest on their laurels and use the level 90 boost feature to, just to get money out of people instead of fixing the problem, which would suck. But certainly it could be designed around, and I'll probably maybe do a video on that sometime in the future. I keep on saying I'll do a video when I think of an interesting topic, but we'll see if I get around to it. Okay, so another thing that's maybe not good about 2 expansions, or 2 tiers per expansion, is that we miss out on that mid tier that's always a bit wacky and generally very high quality. So if we look at the Wrath of the Lich King expansion, Ulduar was the mid-tier expansion, or the mid-tier... I am mincing my words today. Ulduar was the mid-expansion tier. It was also regarded to be the best tier of that expansion. Let's look at Cataclysm. Well, in Cataclysm, Firelands was considered to be the best single raid. If we look at Mists of Pandaria, well, actually I think Mists of Pandaria had lots of great raids, but certainly I think a lot of people really did like Throne of Thunder. It was cool having a new island, new art style, new art palette, new music, all that stuff, and I thought it was a very well designed raid. Perhaps Siege of Orgrimmar is better in some ways, but I think Siege is also worse in some ways, and I just don't know which one I preferred the most. I certainly do know that I was able to raid Throne of Thunder longer before I got burnt out on it, so take that for what you will. Also, Lei Shen was totally, I think, a better boss than Garrosh, and I know a lot of the big hardcore people with their heroic difficulty stuff really loved Lei Shen. But basically, if we miss out on that mid-tier, then we're not going to get that new wacky art palette or the new tier that's a bit different and kind of not isolated from the expansion story, but just a bit out there and interesting, you know? Throne of Thunder was certainly a break from the, you know, the Sha and the Garrosh stuff. It was a break from that. Ulduar was a break from the Undead. And I guess Firelands was, yeah, it was all in with Deathwing's forces, but it was at least a bit of a break from tentacles appearing and trying to kill you. Like in, you know, Hour of Twilight, or not Hour of Twilight, the Bastion of Twilight and Dragon Soul. But yeah, we'd miss out on that mid-tier, and I think that'd be kind of sad because a lot of those mid-expansion tiers have been really high quality. Another problem is the gear progression is going to be really strange when you take it over a two-tier period. You know, when you're like gearing up in the very first tier of an expansion, that's great because you know, oh yeah, this is going to really help me out in the next tier, and then that gear will help me out in the tier after that, and okay, then there'll be a bit of a reset. Whereas if there's only 2 tiers in an expansion, it's just like you gear up once and you think, ugh, is there even any point in gearing up in this final tier? I don't know, it's just as if they may end up cycling players through gear a little bit too fast, and that could be an issue. However, one thing that I have noticed in Warlords is that your endgame raiding gear, like if you're in 580 gear currently, that stuff's going to be relevant-ish at level 100. In fact, your legendary cloak, it's going to be quickly replaced at level 100, but initially it will be useful, and you never know if its itemization is good enough, then perhaps it's going to last, because item level 616 is pretty good when you consider the raid gears like 645 and 655 and 665, I believe. So yeah, it's certainly something that's worth taking into account. Right, another thing is that, smaller expansions could mean that the kind of breadth of possibility within each setting may not fully be explored. So imagine if Wrath of the Lich King was a 2-tier expansion, and you just did Naxxramas, and then you did ICC. I think that would be a bit of a pity. You know, even with Pandaria, imagine if you did the 5.0 raids, and then you did the 5.4 raids. I think the Lei Shen stuff allowed you to explore more of the setting, and the Thunder King, and all that lore, and I thought that was pretty cool, actually. You know, you got to experience the Fireland stuff in Cataclysm, you got Ulduar in Wrath, missing out on just some of the breadth of each zone, you know, and even just having less minor content patches also means you maybe won't get to experience as much of the setting as you possibly could have. And also, if you are having yearly expansions, then the leveling experience I think would be more like it is in Warlords, where it's sort of short and sweet, and full of high quality content, but not necessarily a great deal of it. I certainly feel like there was a lot more meat to Northrend, and the Northrend did feel a bit more fleshed out in terms of just how much stuff there was crammed in there. Yeah, I don't think there would be as much of that in a yearly expansion, and perhaps 1 or 2 things may be just missed out in terms of them fully utilizing the breadth of possibility within the settings, because they really can do some great stuff with the settings that the developers are able to think of. I mean, if you just think of Draenor, there's easily, in my opinion, 3 raid tiers worth here. There's so much interesting stuff in this planet, and if we only get to do Tanam as our final raid, and then actually that would make it Ogre raid, Orc raid, then Orc/Legion raid. I just feel like there's probably more to the planet than that. Though I suppose they never really have been able to fully utilize their expansions. In Cataclysm we missed out on the underwater raid, I say underwater as in it took place in underwater, but I'd imagine you'd still be just running around platforms like normal. I'm pretty sure Gundrak was supposed to be a raid, and also the Nexus was supposed to be a raid in Wrath, so they always miss the mark a bit, but I think they may just miss things a little bit more, or perhaps just create expansions with a bit less scope and a bit less imagination, because they're constantly thinking of, oh, what's next? We must churn and churn and churn and move from expansion to expansion ultra fast. And then I think finally, just on the production side, I think that if they are planning on doing yearly expansions and they just find out in pre-production that one of their, wow, I minced my words. But if they find out in pre-production that perhaps their next expansion just isn't really panning out how they would have liked, ooh, then that's going to hurt their schedule bad. Think what happened with 5.4 and the 6-month delay to Warlords. I think stuff like that, if it did happen in a yearly expansion sort of setting, would really hurt the game. But anyway, they're just a few thoughts that I wrote down in a Word doc earlier. Overall, I think that yearly expansions have actually got an extremely large amount of potential. Absolutely, lots of potential. And I think that it would, even on just for a 2 or 3 year stint, I think it would be a very interesting experiment. I mean, World of Warcraft can definitely sustain development like this for a good number of years. And frankly, as I said, with yearly expansions, one thing that you're going to be damn sure of is that player retention isn't going to suffer, because you're going to constantly have a new expansion and a new shiny to keep people interested. We'll have to see how things pan out for Warlords of Draenor. I just thought it was worth sticking on the camera and giving my thoughts on this. But yeah, that's basically it. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time. And one little thing before I finish the outro. The lighting behind me's bollocksed up because I don't have a proper setup yet, lighting and stuff, but don't worry, that's in the works. And yeah, well, I suppose I've already done my outro, so I suppose I'll see you all later then.